Welcome to Mama's Casserole, the podcast where business meets a little bit of everything. I'm your host, Zach Romero, serving up a hearty mix of insights, stories, and surprises. From strategies to grow your hustle to the latest tech trends, current events, and even a dash of conspiracy theories. There's always something bubbling in the oven. So grab a plate, pull up a chair, and dig into Mama's Casserole. Let's dish it out together. Hey, today we're diving into one of the greatest engineering feats in history, the Panama Canal. This isn't just a story about digging a really big ditch. It's a tale of ambition, struggle, politics, and innovation that changed global trade forever. We'll talk about the visionaries, the hardships, and even the scandals that shaped the canal's construction. So grab a plate and settle in, because we're about to dish out the fascinating history of the Panama Canal right here on Mama's Casserole. The Panama Canal is a 50-mile-long pathway through the Isthmus of Panama, providing a shortcut for ships traveling between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Now, this topic has been in the news quite a bit, and that's mainly the reason I wanted to really dig into the Panama Canal. I knew what it was. I know what it is. I've shipped products through it myself, so I know how it works, at least on a daily basis, very simply. But our president bringing it up in the news has really brought this to the forefront of my mind, and so I really wanted to dig into this. And there is a huge history to it, and pretty exciting, actually, and quite interesting. A lot of intrigue to it. I mean, this really could be a great novel, movie, whatever it may be, because there's so much behind it. You know, when the canal was completed in 1914, it transformed international trade and relations, marking really a turning point in global shipping routes. In 1999, the ownership of the canal was officially transferred from the U.S. to Panama, which was a significant event in Panama's history. It generates significant revenue for Panama through the tolls that they charge, with over 12,000 ships using that canal every year. And the canal isn't just a moneymaker, but it's a strategically important waterway. It plays a crucial role in global trade and transportation, with 6% of the global maritime trade passing through its locks. That's a huge number when you think about everything that goes on in this world. But the idea of it goes way back. It's even 1513, when the Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa became the first European to discover that the Isthmus of Panama was just a slim land bridge separating the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And so his discovery sparked a search for a natural waterway linking the two oceans. I mean, he wanted to go natural first. In the 1500s, they weren't thinking about digging a ditch across it. And in 1534, after they had searched and looked and they didn't find a natural passage, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, actually ordered a survey to determine if one could be built. But the surveyors back then eventually decided it was impossible. And so today, we're going to cover the history of the Panama Canal in today's episode. You know, everything from pre-canal transportation issues, the first attempts at building it, and the challenges that thwarted those attempts. We're even going to cover how the U.S. became involved, and the engineering and technological feats that it took to complete the task. And we're even going to cover some current events that have been in the news lately, as I mentioned earlier, in regards to the Panama Canal. And so always the question begins is, why was a canal even needed? You know, what was the point of it? And the Panama Canal shortcut greatly reduces the time for ships to travel between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, enabling them to avoid the lengthy and even hazardous route around the southernmost tip of South America, which is called the Drake Passage, the Strait of Magellan, or even the Beagle Channel. It can save, depending on the ship, anywhere from 10 to 22 days on a journey for a ship. That's an enormous savings for any freight carrier. And it was a long and dangerous journey around South America. You know, before that, they were looking at land bridges and even maybe carting stuff by donkeys and mules across that 50-mile stretch on the land. And so that was what they first looked at. And the first attempt to actually make the isthmus part of a trade route was called the Darien scheme, launched by the Kingdom of Scotland, which was abandoned because of the inhospitable conditions. It was a really rough area. And so then coming in the early 80s, a German naturalist, Alexander von Humboldt, published an essay on the geography of the Spanish colonies of Central America. And in this essay, he considered 5 possible routes for a canal across Central America, including Panama. But he concluded that the most promising location was across Nicaragua, traversing Lake Nicaragua. So they were going to use a lake and part of waterway that was already there. And his recommendations actually influenced the British to attempt a canal in 1843. This did come to nothing, and it resulted in a treaty between the United Kingdom and the U.S., in which the two nations bound each other to joint control of any canal built in Nicaragua, or by implication anywhere in Central America. So this right there tells you that going all the way back to the 1500s, and now we're into the 1800s, they were looking and researching and even attempting some different avenues to get across this stretch of Central America. They knew they had to figure something out for the future of ship travel and sea travel, whether it be cargo or not. This would cut off so much time and save a lot of lives because of the danger of going around the southern tip of South America. And so in 1846, the U.S. and New Grenada even came into a treaty, which granted the U.S. the transit rights and the right to actually intervene militarily in the isthmus. But in the 80s and the late 1840s, the discovery of gold in California created a huge demand for a crossing of Panama as a practical route. This is what really pushed things forward. And this demand was exploited by William Henry Aspinwall, an American businessman who ran steamship legs from New York City to Panama, and then from Panama to California. But he did an overland portage through Panama. And so he set up an overland route, because this right here tells us once again, they've got to figure this out. So between 1850 and 1855, Aspinwall built a railroad from Colón on the Caribbean Sea to Panama City. And that project cost U.S. $8 million, which was 6 times the estimated cost. And between 6,000 and 12,000 construction workers who actually died of tropical diseases. But the railroad did become immensely profitable for its owners. This had forced U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant to establish an interoceanic canal commission. And he commissioned several naval officers, including Commander Thomas Oliver Selfridge, to investigate possible routes suggested by Humboldt for a canal. So here comes the U.S. already digging in to figure out a route. But the first country and the first group to attempt the actual construction of a canal was the French. And the diplomat and entrepreneur Ferdinand de Lesseps was the driving force behind this. He made his reputation by successfully constructing the Suez Canal, which is a famous canal, still used to this day, proved its value in international commerce. So here is the leading figure in building canals to help this. And so after this success, he actively sought new projects. And in 1875, he was approached by a group known as the Tudor Syndicate, a syndicate formed to promote the building of an interoceanic canal across Panama. So they knew after the Suez Canal worked and how profitable it was, they had to do something. So Ferdinand Lesseps, he convened an international congress in Paris to examine the possibilities of a ship canal. And among the 136 delegates covered by 26 countries, only 42 were engineers, with the remainder being speculators, politicians, and even just friends of de Lesseps. So he used this congress of people to promote fundraising for his preferred scheme or his preferred way of building this, which was just to build a sea-level canal across Panama, which is what happened with the Suez Canal. And he was able to gain approval of a majority of these delegates, despite reservations expressed by some who preferred the Nicaragua transit or even emphasized the engineering difficulties and health risks. So following the Congress, he organized a company to construct the canal, and the company bought the Wise concession from the Tudor Syndicate, and he was able to raise considerable funds from small French investors on the basis of the huge profits generated by the Suez Canal. So the construction began on January 1st, 1881, with digging at Culebra, beginning on January 22nd. And a large labor force was assembled, numbering right around 40,000 in 1888. And 9/10 or 90% of these were Afro-Caribbean workers from the West Indies. Although the project attracted good, well-paid French engineers, retaining them was difficult due to the diseases. So the death toll from 1881 to 1889 was estimated at over 22,000. of whom as many as 5,000 were French citizens. So from the beginning, the French Canal project faced difficulties. Although the Panama Canal needed to be only 40%. So from the beginning, the French Canal project faced difficulties. Although the Panama Canal needed to be only 40% as long as the Suez Canal, it was much more of an engineering challenge because of the combination of the rainforest, the debilitating climate, the need for actual canal locks, and the lack of any ancient route to follow. So beginning with Armand Reclus in 1882, a series of engineers resigned in discouragement. And the workers were unprepared for the conditions of the rainy season, during which the Chagres River, where the canal started, became a raging torrent, rising up to 33 feet. So the workers had to continually widen this cut through the mountains and reduce the angles of the slopes to minimize landslides in the canal. This just continued on and continued on. And so in France, de Lesseps kept the investment and the supply of workers flowing, even long after it was obvious that the targets were not being met. And eventually the money did run out. So this French effort went bankrupt in 1889 after reportedly spending right around $287 million US, which in today's numbers is about 10 billion. And an estimated 22,000 men died from disease and accidents. And the savings of over 800,000 investors was lost. So they finally suspended work on May 15th. And in the ensuing scandal known as the Panama Affair, some of those deemed responsible were actually prosecuted, including Gustave Eiffel. De Lesseps and his son Charles were found guilty of misappropriation of funds and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. The sentence was later overturned, and the father at age 88 was never imprisoned. So another French company was created to take over the project, but really this just never took off. So the big turning point came when the U.S. decided to acquire this project. And in 1897 through 99, the U.S. President William McKinley, he tasked 2 commissions headed by Admiral John Grimes Walker to recommend the best route for a canal. Although the first commission had been tasked only to consider routes across Nicaragua, they did successfully lobby the government to broaden the terms of reference to also include the Panamanian Isthmus. So here is where they found out, here's what we really think needs to happen. And they actually came in with a quote of about $109 million, even though they thought that was quite excessive. And this report was leaked to Philippe Benoit Varida, who during an emergency shareholders meeting of the French company, he amended the price to a formal offer of $40 million, trying to undercut the U.S. So on December 10th, George S. Morrison, the most eminent engineer on the commission, wrote a letter to President Roosevelt giving the technical reasons for preferring the Panama route. So Roosevelt called the members of the commission and asked them to give their own personal evaluations. He listened to the individual engineers, and he held a closed meeting with the entire commission where he made it clear he wanted the offer to take over the Panama route from the French company to be accepted. So the French were like, man, we're done with this. We're out of it. Here you go. And so the proposal to purchase the rights to Panama from the French faced considerable opposition in Congress since the Nicaragua proposal was preferred. So here comes the politics already. Which route would make the most sense came down to politics. But the commission and the engineers truly believed the Panamanian route was the best. And so that group was supported by the president, and they ended up getting what they wanted out of it. So this is the point where I learned the most of what was going on here. Because I started reading about how the Hay-Heran Treaty that was signed on the 22nd of January of 1903 between the U.S. and Colombia for $10 million and an annual payment, it would have granted the U.S. a renewable lease in perpetuity from Colombia on the land proposed for the canal. And this confused me because I thought we were talking about Panama. And my lack of history knowledge of what's going on here, maybe I did read about it in high school, maybe I didn't. The reason for this is Panama was not an independent country at this time. It was part of Colombia. And so we had this treaty signed between our U.S. Secretary of State at the time, which was John Hay, and the Colombian Chargé Tomás Herán. And that's why it was called the Hay-Heran Treaty. And the U.S. ratified this very quickly in March of 1903, but the Senate of Colombia unanimously rejected this treaty because it had been significantly unpopular in Bogota due to concerns over insufficient compensation, that we didn't pay them enough, the threat to their sovereignty and their perpetuity. They were afraid that it wasn't going to help them in the long run. And so President Roosevelt, he changed tactics based in part on a treaty that was from 1846, and he actively supported the separation of Panama from Colombia. So shortly after recognizing Panama, he signed a treaty with the new Panamanian government under terms similar to the Hay-Haran Treaty. So on the 2nd of November of 1903, now just 10 months after this first treaty was signed, U.S. warships actually blocked the sea lanes against possible Colombian troop movements en route to put down the Panama Rebellion. So Panama declared independence the very next day on November 3rd, and the U.S. quickly recognized the new nation. This happened so quickly, but by the time the Colombian government in Bogota launched a response to the Panamanian uprising, U.S. troops were already entered the province. And so the Colombian troops dispatched to Panama were assembled so quickly that they had no training. And while these conscripts may have been able to defeat the Panamanian rebels, there was no way they would be able to defeat the U.S. Army troops that were supporting the rebels. So the army of conscripts was the best response the Colombians could muster, as they were still recovering from a civil war. So the U.S. was fully aware of these conditions and even incorporated them into the planning of the Panama intervention, as the U.S. acted as an arbitrator between the two sides. So this peace treaty that they signed quickly was called the Thousand-Day War. It was signed on the U.S. Wisconsin in November of 1902. And while in port, the U.S. also brought engineering teams to Panama with the peace delegation to begin planning before the U.S. had even gained rights to build the canal. So when we helped Colombia in the Thousand-Day War in 1902, we already started planning what we were going to do. And this happened very quickly. When you talk about a year's time in politics, that's quick. So from January of 2003 to when we signed a treaty with the Colombian politician, it was a matter of 10 months by the time Panama declared its independence, and we were blocking the Colombian troops from putting down the Panamanian rebellion. So President Roosevelt, he famously stated, "I took the isthmus, I started the canal, and then left Congress not to debate the canal, but to debate me." And several parties in the U.S. called this an act of war on Colombia. And the New York Times even described the support given by the U.S. to Benoit Varela as an act of sordid conquest by helping Panama. The New York Evening Post even called it a vulgar and mercenary venture. And the U.S. maneuvers are often cited as a classic example of U.S. gunboat diplomacy in Latin America. And this is the best illustration of what Roosevelt meant by the old African adage, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far." So after the revolution in 2003, the Republic of Panama became a U.S. protectorate until 1939. So this gives the U.S. the rights. Panama will do anything to please the U.S. for their independence, and hence the construction of the Panama Canal. So the U.S. purchased the French equipment and all the excavations, including the Panama Railroad, that was left behind from the previous projects for about $40 million US, of which $30 million related to the excavations completed primarily in that Culebra cut, valued at about $1 per cubic yard. And they also paid the new country of Panama $10 million as a flat fee, and the annual payment was about $250,000 each following year. And in 1921, Colombia and the U.S. entered into another treaty in which the U.S. agreed to pay Colombia $25 million, $5 million upon ratification, and then $4 or $5 million annual payments, and grant Colombia special privileges in the Canal Zone. And in return, Colombia recognized Panama as an independent nation. So at the end of the day, the U.S. also facilitated Panama's independence and actually being recognized by Colombia. So in the meantime, though, from 1904 to 1914 was the actual U.S. construction of the Panama Canal. And that's where we took formal control of the property on May 4th of 1904, when we bought all that from the U.S., from the French. And President Teddy Roosevelt, he appointed John Finley Wallace, formerly a chief engineer and finally the general manager of an Illinois Central Railroad, as the chief engineer of this Panama Canal project. So now he has to deal with the disease-plagued country, forced to use dilapidated French infrastructure and equipment, as well as being frustrated by the overly bureaucratic ICC. And so he resigned abruptly in June of 2005. So within a year, he was done. And so they had to appoint a new chief engineer, John Frank Stevens, a self-educated engineer who built the Great Northern Railroad. He was not a member of the IC. He increasingly viewed its bureaucracy as a serious hindrance. He bypassed the commission, sending requests and demands directly to the Roosevelt administration. So one of his first achievements in Panama was in building and rebuilding the housing, the cafeterias, the hotels, the water systems, the repair shops. I mean, everything that had to do with building the canal. He started with the amenities or the housing and some of the basic needs of the workers first. And this allowed him to recruit and entice thousands of workers from the U.S. and other areas to come to work. And so workers from the Caribbean were also called Afro-Panamanians. They came in large numbers and many settled permanently. He tried to provide accommodation in which the workers could work and live in reasonable safety, but he also reestablished and enlarged the railway, which was to prove crucial in transporting all the tons of soil from the cut through the mountains to the dam across the river. So this was a huge undertaking. So now we have healthier and far better living conditions for the workers, which was another benefit given to the American citizens working on the canal. And they also provided them a medal for 2 years of service. This was a government thank you. Additional bars were added for each 2-year period after that. And this was became popularly known as the Roosevelt Medal. And a total of 7,189 were ultimately issued, with a few people receiving as many as 4 bars. And so that you're talking about 6 years in quite an environment. In 1905, the U.S. actually commissioned to review the design, which had not been finalized. So they spent a whole year just getting all the infrastructure ready to even be able to work from. And then in 1905, they reviewed the canal design, which had not even been finalized. In January of 2006, the panel finally recommended to President Roosevelt a sea-level canal, as had been attempted by the French and temporarily abandoned for a lock system. But in 1906, Stevens, who had seen the River Chagres in full flood, which we mentioned earlier, which could get up to 33 feet of flooding, he was summoned to Washington, and he declared a sea-level approach to be an entirely untenable proposition. So he argued in favor of a canal using a lock system to raise and lower the ships to a reservoir about 85 feet above sea level. This would create both the largest dam and the largest human-made lake in the world at that time. And the water to refill the locks would be taken from the Gatun Lake by opening and closing enormous gates and valves. So many of us know what locks are, and this allows them to raise the ships up to the next level or lower them down to the next level, depending on which way that they are transiting. And so the construction of a canal with locks requires the excavation of more than 17 million cubic yards of material over and above the 30 million that were already excavated by the French. So as quickly as possible, the Americans replaced or upgraded the old equipment, and with new construction equipment that was designed for a much larger and faster scale of work. Over 100 railroad-mounted steam shovels were purchased. These were joined by enormous steam-powered cranes, giant hydraulic rock crushers, concrete mixers, and all kinds of large and updated equipment that was built primarily for the construction of this large project. And the railroad also had to be comprehensively upgraded with heavy-duty double-tracked rails over most of the line, because it was going to be carrying a lot of weight and a lot of cubic yards of dirt out. So between 1912 and 1914, there was also a controversy about the tolls for the canal. And so in 1907, Stevens resigned as the chief engineer. And his replacement, appointed by Teddy Roosevelt again, was U.S. Army Major George Washington Goethals of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So he took on the work, and he divided the engineering and the excavation work into 3 divisions: the Atlantic, the Central, and the Pacific. The Atlantic Division was responsible for construction of the breakwater at the entrance to the Gatun locks and their 3.5-mile approach channel and the dam. Now, the Pacific Division under Sidney Williamson, which he was the only civilian member of this high-level team, he was similarly responsible for the Pacific 3-mile breakwater in Panama Bay, the approach to the locks, and 2 of the locks and their associated dams and reservoirs. Now, the Central Division, which was controlled by the U.S. Army Corps, was assigned one of the most difficult parts. They had to excavate the Culebra Cut through the Continental Divide to connect the Gatun Lake to the Pacific Panama Canal locks. So now, 1913, we have a new president, Woodrow Wilson, and he sent a signal from the White House by telegraph, which triggered the explosion that destroyed the Gamboa Dike. This flooded the Culebra Cut, thereby joining the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans via the Panama Canal. This was a momentous occasion, and a floating crane was the first self-propelled vessel to transit the canal from ocean to ocean. This is one of the original floating cranes that was brought in by the French, and it finally reached the Pacific on the 7th of January, 1914. So this was a great undertaking and achievement, and the construction of the canal was completed in 1914, 401 years after Panama was first crossed overland by the Europeans by Vasco Núñez de Balboa and his conquistadores. The U.S. spent almost $500 million, which is roughly equivalent to $15.7 billion in today's money, to finish the project. This was by far the largest American engineering project to date, and the canal was formally opened on August 15, 1914, with the passage of the cargo ship SS Ancon. And the opening of this canal caused a severe drop in traffic along Chilean ports due to shifts in maritime trade routes. Despite the closure of the canal for nearly 7 months after a landslide in September 18, 1915. And the burgeoning sheep farming business in southern Patagonia suffered a significant setback by the change in the trade routes, as did even the economy of the Falkland Islands. So this didn't only create a great savings on time, on transit, on cost, but actually negatively affected the economies that were along that southern route of the South America. And so this was great on one hand and very hard for others on the other way. And so in 1914, the steam shovels from the Panama Canal were purchased and put to use in copper mines in northern Chile. So they started selling off the equipment. But this brings us to the control and even the handover of the Panama Canal. So by the 30s, water supply became an issue for the canal, prompting construction of the Madden Dam across the Chagre River above the Gatun Lake. And this created the Madden Lake, which provides additional water storage for the canal, because they will have some droughts at times, and then they have problems filling up the locks. So in 1939, construction began on a further major improvement, new sets of locks, large enough to carry larger warships that the U.S. was building at the time and planned to continue building. Now remember, this is the time of World War II. The U.S. wasn't in it yet, but the U.S. was building some warships. And the Panama Canal was not big enough at that time to handle these ships. So here comes an upgrade already in the 30s. But after World War II, U.S. controlled the canal, and the canal zone started to become contentious. Relations between Panama and the U.S. became increasingly tense, and many Panamanians felt that the zone rightfully belonged to Panama. Student protests were even met by the fencing in of the zone and an increased military presence. Demands for the U.S. to hand over the canal to Panama, increased after the Suez Crisis in 1956, when the U.S. used financial and diplomatic pressure to force France and the U.K. to abandon their attempt to retake control of the Suez Canal. So the U.S. is putting pressure on two other countries to give up control or to stop trying to regain control of the Suez Canal, even though they were the ones who helped build it. But we're not, as Americans, we're not letting go of the Panama Canal, even though there is now starting to have unrest and demands and all of these things happening to push us to give it up. So Panamanian unrest culminated in riots on Martyrs' Day, January 9th of 1964, when about 20 Panamanians and around 3 to 5 U.S. soldiers were killed. But this didn't change anything. A decade later, in 1974, negotiations toward a settlement began and resulted in some treaties. So on September 7th, 1977, the treaty was signed by the President of the U.S., Jimmy Carter, and Omar Torrijos, the de facto leader from Panama. This mobilized the process of granting Panamanians free control of the canal, so long as Panama signed a treaty guaranteeing the permanent neutrality of the canal. And this will come into play much later. The treaty led to full Panamanian control effective at noon on 31st of December 1999. And the Panama Canal Authority, or the ACP, assumed command of the water, and the Panama Canal remains one of the chief revenue sources for Panama today. But before this handover, the government of Panama held an international bid to negotiate a 25-year contract for operation of the container shipping ports located at the canal's Atlantic and Pacific outlets. This contract was not affiliated with the ACP or the Panama Control operations and was won by the firm Hutchison Whampoa, a Hong Kong-based shipping interest owned by Li Ka-shing. So this is what takes us into the first century and where we've been over the last while. And Panama has recently cut off their affiliation with China and Hong Kong with the control over the ports or over the canal. But there are ports coming in and ports coming out. And so what happened is when President Trump came in and was elected, he started to assert that the U.S. should retake control of the Panama Canal. Just similar back in the 50s and 60s when the UK and France wanted to retake control of the Suez Canal. Similar concept. We built it. We created this moneymaker for you. But yet the U.S. did eventually in 1999 give control back to Panama. The last day of 1999, it really essentially started on the first day of the 21st century when Panama had full control and then turned around and accepted money to let somebody else basically run it for them, which sets the tolls, which sets the fees. And although the U.S. built this and finished this project, we're being charged for every container ship and even for every military ship that goes through there. And this is where the contention started to come in here recently in 2024 when President President-elect Donald Trump started to assert that we should retake control of the Panama Canal, claiming that the rates Panama was charging American ships were exorbitant and in violation of the Torrijos-Carter treaties. And the following day, he claimed that the canal was falling into the wrong hands, referring to China. So shortly after Trump's comments, the Panamanian president, Jose Raul Mulino, responded, denying that the U.S. was being unfairly charged or that anyone besides Panama was in full control of the canal. And he affirmed that the canal was part of the country's inalienable patrimony. Though the Hong Kong company does have a concession to operate two ports near the ends of the canal, the Balboa port on the Pacific side and the Cristobal port on the Atlantic side, neither of these ports nor the company control access to the canal. But three other ports near the ends are operated by companies from Taiwan and Singapore, and a joint venture from the U.S. and Panama. So on December 24th, here in 2024, a protest was held at the U.S. Embassy in Panama City over Trump's threats to take back the Panama Canal. Protesters referred to him as a public enemy of Panama. And on the same day, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, made up of 10 Central and South American countries, denounced Trump's comments and affirmed its support for Panama's sovereignty, their territorial integrity, and even self-determination. So on January 7th, 2025, Trump held a press conference, and he vowed to gain control of the Panama Canal. He refused to rule out economic and military action against Panama. He reiterated his intent to take back control of that canal in his inaugural address. So on the February 5th, the U.S. Department of State posted on Twitter that the Panama Canal would no longer be charging U.S. government vessels to cross. So already, President Molino called this an intolerable falsehood, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio had to correct the announcement, saying he expects Panama to be doing so in return for the Torrijos-Carter Treaty's guarantee of U.S. military protection in the event of an attack on the canal. So there were agreements in that our military was supposed to be given access without charges. But look, who knows what the future is going to hold? This is an ongoing discussion between Panama and the U.S., and is the U.S. going to go in and militarily take over the Panama Canal? I personally do not believe so. I believe this is just a power play to get some agreements changed, some new treaties signed, some different funds coming in for the U.S., or at least less charges. The administration's whole platform was about saving money and recovering money. So right there is what this is about, is to renegotiate, to re-look at what has been agreed to over the years and what's actually been happening. And so the Panama Canal, at the end of the day, is one of the most important shipping ports and canals in the world. I have shipped things from Asia to the East Coast through the Panama Canal. And then there's also been times to avoid some of those fees that has been charged to the U.S. at really exorbitant rates. I have actually ported it on the West Coast and put it on a train and taken it to the East Coast and actually have come out ahead. Now, timing sometimes takes a lot longer because when it comes to rail, they like to really consolidate the containers, consolidate them on shipments. They don't just, well, you got a container and they don't send a train off for me, right? So they're going to put all that together. So the timing takes quite a bit longer. But really, because of the exorbitant fees that, and I'm sure it's not just America, but that we are charged, and the tolls to cross that canal are pretty high. And so we really are looking at other options for this. And this canal will continue to be one of the most important avenues for shipping for America and really for the world. Because even with all the tariffs coming in and really the questions on tariffs, business will never stop. People will continue to buy. People will adjust. The demand for products starts to slip when the tariffs go up. So in return, the shipping companies, to try to keep shipping going, to try to keep costs coming in or revenue, they start to drop their prices. So already within the last couple of weeks, I've already seen freight costs come down on container shipments from overseas. And so that's pretty much has offset these initial round of tariffs. So look, people, humanity, Americans, the world, we all adjust to what's going on. And we might not know what's going to happen on the next day, the next week, the next round of tariffs. Things can change. All tariffs are really is political movements. And that's what we've seen these last couple of weeks, these last couple of months, is they've been used to just leverage agreements, leverage negotiations on borders, to leverage different things. And so we're going to see continual changes over the next while, and we're going to adjust to it. And I wanted to cover the Panama Canal because it is an interesting topic. It has a deep history, but not just a deep history. It has a future for everybody, and it affects everybody. It affects the homeowner. It affects the person in the Midwest and on the Great Plains who may never travel outside of their little world, who may never do business overseas, and somebody who just plugs away, making a living, doing the best they can, going to the grocery store, buying a product, going to Walmart, going to their department store to buy something for their home. This canal affects them by the prices and the tolls that are charged, and really by the agreements, by the decisions that politicians make in multiple countries. It affects us every day by our prices on our products. And so this Panama Canal, although it may be a small strip of waterway in a Central American country that most people never travel to, I never have, and really I have no desire to, but that little strip of land affects me every day. It affects you. It affects our families. And so not only is the history colorful, interesting to me, and probably to many of you, but the future of the Panama Canal is really what's at stake now. Who controls it, and what the fees are going to be, and what's going to happen with it in the future. So I thank you for joining me on this little history tour. I appreciate the time that you've given me, and come back again. Let's learn something new every time we come. And I really appreciate the time and the commitment that all of my listeners are putting into my podcast. It means the world to me. I'm a new podcast, but I've already had people that I know text me, email me, message me, ask me when the next episode's coming out. So join us on this little journey, and we'll have fun together. But once again, thanks for joining me on Mama's Casserole. And until next time, have a good week.